Right now, we are at a situation where American crocodiles were endangered as recently as 15 or 16 years ago in 2007. They are now, guys, endangered.
No one warned Florida for this. The Everglades didn't erupt into chaos overnight. There were no alarms, no bodies, no obvious signs of a takeover. Instead, the swamp just went quiet. The kind of quiet that only happens when something at the very top realizes it's no longer safe. Full-grown crocodiles began vanishing without a trace, not fleeing storms or starvation, but abandoning territory they had ruled for decades. That alone terrified scientists, because there is almost nothing on Earth that makes an apex predator retreat. And when officials finally understood what was forcing them out, the conversation quietly shifted from conservation to containment. Because whatever had entered Florida's waters wasn't just surviving there, it was hunting. And it didn't see humans as off-limits. For most of modern history, the Florida Everglades wasn't a lawless wilderness. It was a system with clear boundaries and an unspoken hierarchy that rarely failed. The slow-moving water and endless sawgrass created a natural divide, and every dominant species knew exactly where it belonged. At the very top were two reptiles that had spent millions of years perfecting coexistence. The American alligator ruled the freshwater heart of the swamp with brute strength and patience, while the American crocodile controlled the salty edges, slipping quietly through mangroves and estuaries. They weren't allies, but they weren't enemies either. Each stayed in its lane, and that balance kept the ecosystem stable. What made this arrangement remarkable wasn't just that it worked, but how predictable it was. Biologists understood their behavior. Rangers could track their nesting grounds year after year. Even humans benefited from this order. Despite their fearsome appearance, the native American crocodile built a reputation as a ghost of the swamp, reclusive, cautious, and uninterested in confrontation. There were no confirmed fatal encounters in the wild across the entire United States. The Everglades had danger, but it was a familiar kind, and familiarity bred safety. That sense of order was the foundation everything rested on. When those invisible lines started blurring, it wasn't just another shift in wildlife patterns. It was the first sign that something powerful had stepped into the system uninvited, and the kings of the swamp were the first to notice. The first clues didn't come from laboratories or official reports. They came from the people who lived on the water. Airboat captains and longtime fishermen, the kind who could recognize individual crocodiles by scars alone, began noticing something that didn't make sense. The largest, most dominant crocodiles were gone. Not displaced, not injured, just missing. Prime basking sites that had been defended for years were suddenly empty, untouched, and eerily quiet. In an ecosystem where territory is everything, abandonment like that doesn't happen without a reason. At first, it was easy to brush off. Predators shift ranges all the time, but this wasn't random movement. Entire breeding zones went silent. Nests that should have been guarded were left exposed. Juveniles vanished before they had a chance to mature. When apex predators stop acting like apex predators, biologists know one thing for certain. Something above them has entered the picture. Fear had crept into a place where fear wasn't supposed to exist. Then the encounters with humans started changing. The American crocodile, known for avoiding people at all costs, began behaving erratically. Fishermen reported sudden charges. Small boats were followed instead of ignored. These weren't attacks, but they weren't normal either. Stress does strange things to animals, especially when they're being pushed out of their own territory. And whatever was applying that pressure wasn't just competing for food, it was forcing the kings of the Everglades into survival mode. That's when the rumors began spreading through the swamp. Locals whispered about a familiar invader finally crossing a line everyone feared, but the truth would turn out to be far worse. When the disappearances became impossible to ignore, attention locked onto a suspect Florida already knew too well, the Burmese python. By then, these massive snakes had earned their reputation as the Everglades' ultimate nightmare.
Mammal populations had collapsed in areas where pythons took hold, and stories of deer, bobcats, and even full-grown alligators being swallowed had already made national headlines. If something was bold enough to challenge crocodiles, the python seemed like the obvious culprit. The theory fit neatly. Pythons were spreading deeper into mangrove territory, overlapping with American crocodile habitat for the first time. They were growing larger every year, adapting faster than expected, and proving they weren't afraid to take on prey nearly their own size. Many believed this was simply the next phase of an ugly turf war, snakes versus reptiles, with the bigger winner finally emerging. For a moment, it felt like the mystery had an answer, but the evidence refused to cooperate. When biologists examined the remains that had been recovered, something was wrong. These crocodiles didn't show the crushing trauma typical of a python kill. There were no signs of prolonged constriction, no skeletal damage consistent with suffocation. Whatever had taken them down wasn't coiling in the shadows and squeezing the life out of its prey. It was overpowering them directly. That realization changed everything. The python wasn't the executioner, it was a distraction. And once that truth settled in, scientists were left facing a far more unsettling question. If it wasn't the Everglades' most infamous invader, what was strong enough to hunt the hunters?
The break in the case didn't come from the heart of the swamp. It came from a place where it absolutely shouldn't have. Near a densely populated canal outside Miami, researchers captured a young crocodile that had no business being there. The location alone set off alarms. This was miles away from any known American crocodile nesting ground, tucked into an urban stretch shaped by concrete and human activity. But when scientists got a closer look, the real unease began. At first glance, it looked almost right. Close enough that most people would have dismissed it instantly. But the longer they stared, the more unsettling the details became. The snout was broader and heavier than expected. The coloration was darker, almost olive black instead of the familiar gray-green. It triggered a strange reaction, the kind you get when something looks familiar but feels wrong. And then there was its behavior. For an animal that young, it showed an aggressive confidence that didn't fit the profile. No hesitation, no retreat, just raw predatory intent. The team considered every possibility: a genetic abnormality, a hybrid, some rare mutation caused by environmental stress. But none of those explanations accounted for what they were seeing in real time. This animal wasn't struggling to survive. It was dominating its surroundings. With no clear answers, tissue samples were sent off for DNA testing, and the waiting began. While researchers waited, more reports poured in. Similar crocodiles spotted in canals, estuaries, and waterways far outside expected ranges. Even more disturbing, these animals were growing faster than native crocodiles of the same age, by a wide margin. Whatever this species was, it wasn't just adapting to Florida. It was outperforming everything else in it. When the DNA results finally came back, there was no room for debate. The animal wasn't a deformed American crocodile. It wasn't a hybrid, and it wasn't some newly evolved variant. The genetic match was exact. What scientists had pulled from that Miami canal belonged to Crocodilus niloticus, the Nile crocodile, a predator native to Africa, confirmed to be living and thriving in Florida's waterways. The implications were immediate and terrifying. The American crocodile had long been considered a low-risk species around humans, with no confirmed fatal encounters in the wild across the United States. The Nile crocodile sits on the opposite end of that spectrum. In its native range, it has a reputation as an indiscriminate man-eater, linked to dozens, sometimes hundreds of fatal encounters every year. Its biology is built for ambush, dominance, and overwhelming force. Larger, faster growing, and far more aggressive, this was not just a stronger cousin, it was a completely different class of predator. Fully grown Nile crocodiles can stretch close to 18 feet, weighing well over a ton,
with a bite force that ranks among the strongest ever recorded. They don't avoid conflict, they exploit it. And suddenly, this wasn't a theoretical threat anymore. The native crocodiles weren't disappearing because of disease or migration. They were being outcompeted, displaced, and possibly hunted by something that had no evolutionary reason to show restraint. An apex predator from 6,000 miles away hadn't just arrived in Florida. It had blended in, taken territory, and begun reshaping the food chain from the top down. But the most disturbing question still hung in the air. This animal didn't cross an ocean on its own. So how did one of the world's most dangerous predators end up hiding in plain sight inside the Everglades? There was only one explanation that made sense, and it was far more uncomfortable than a natural invasion. These crocodiles didn't migrate, they didn't drift in on storms, and they certainly didn't swim across the Atlantic. Every path led back to human hands. In South Florida, that trail almost always ends at the same place, the exotic animal trade. Florida has long been a global hotspot for private collectors who treat dangerous wildlife like status symbols. Nile crocodiles are strictly illegal to own without high-level permits and specialized containment, but that hasn't stopped them from entering the state through back channels. As hatchlings, they're small, manageable, and deceptively harmless. But they don't stay that way for long. When the reality sets in and the animal becomes too large, too aggressive, and too dangerous to control, some owners make a reckless decision. They release it. What sealed this conclusion was the genetic evidence. The Nile crocodiles that were captured weren't random individuals from different sources. They were nearly identical at the DNA level. That meant they likely came from the same clutch, released or escaped around the same time. One careless act, possibly years earlier, had quietly set the stage for an ecological takeover. These crocodiles didn't just survive once they were loose. They adapted faster than expected, blending in among native species and exploiting the same nesting grounds. By the time scientists realized what was happening, the animals weren't newcomers anymore. They were residents, and worse, they were breeding. That realization turned concern into urgency because the real danger wasn't where these crocodiles were found. It was where they could spread next. Looking at the situation from a broader perspective, it became painfully clear that humans were the real invasive force. The Nile crocodiles were just the symptom, not the cause. Florida has a long history of ecological disasters triggered by careless human decisions. Burmese pythons, green iguanas, lionfish, all thriving because someone underestimated the consequences of introducing a non-native species. But this time, the stakes were far higher. The Native American crocodile had already been weakened before the Nile crocs even arrived. Decades of habitat destruction, mangroves replaced with condos, estuaries altered for agriculture, water poisoned by runoff had confined the local predators to shrinking corners of the swamp. Conservation efforts, while well-intentioned, often couldn't offset these pressures. The natural defenses of these reptiles were breaking down, leaving them vulnerable to a superior predator introduced by human negligence. And then there's the exotic pet trade itself, a reckless, largely unregulated industry. Tiny hatchlings, cute enough to charm a collector, grow into apex predators with no instinct to coexist with humans. Once released, intentionally or accidentally, these animals find a world shaped perfectly for their survival. The Everglades, with its abundant water, food, and hiding places, became an ideal playground for one of the planet's most aggressive predators. The moral weight of it is undeniable. The monster wasn't born in Florida, it was imported, nurtured by human curiosity and carelessness, and left to flourish while native species paid the price. In this story, the real villain isn't the crocodile, it's the system that allowed it to invade unchecked. The consequences aren't just theoretical, they're already unfolding. These Nile crocodiles aren't confined to hidden swamps or remote estuaries. Their cold tolerance means they could move north,
expanding far beyond the southernmost tip of Florida. Every waterway, canal, and mangrove forest becomes potential territory, and with that comes risk to both wildlife and humans. Tourism, a cornerstone of Florida's economy, is suddenly on the line. People come to kayak, fish, and explore the Everglades expecting beauty and adventure, not apex predators that view humans as potential prey. Even a single Nile crocodile sighting in a public area can trigger panic, damage confidence in safety, and force authorities to spend millions tracking and capturing animals that move faster and grow stronger than native species. The reality for wildlife officials is brutal. They can't simply relocate these predators or return them to Africa. To protect the public, eradication efforts must be permanent and decisive. That means hunting, capturing, and often euthanizing animals that outcompete native species and threaten human life. It's a war declared against one of the planet's most powerful hunters, an apex predator that should never have been in Florida at all. The Everglades, once a sanctuary of balance and quiet survival, is becoming a designated danger zone. Warning signs for alligators might soon be replaced with far darker notices, areas patrolled by predators that can and will see humans as food. And that shift changes everything. It alters the human relationship with the wild, brings ecological consequences, and leaves a haunting question in its wake. What else have we invited into our backyards without realizing the price? In the end, the story of the Nile crocodiles in Florida isn't just about an apex predator taking over a new territory. It's about the consequences of human carelessness, greed, and short-sightedness. By altering habitats, ignoring regulations, and treating deadly predators like pets, we created the perfect conditions for one of the world's most aggressive hunters to thrive in our own backyard. The Native American crocodile, once secure in its home, now faces displacement and decline, not from nature, but from the ripple effects of our decisions. The Everglades, a place once defined by balance and predictable survival, has become a warning. The monsters lurking there aren't solely the creatures themselves, they are the choices that brought them here. One reckless act, one released hatchling can ripple across decades, transforming ecosystems, threatening human safety, and forcing us into a conflict we never wanted. It's a stark lesson. The real invader isn't always visible, and the most dangerous predators aren't always the ones with sharp teeth and armored hides. Sometimes the threat comes from the humans shaping the world around them. And as the Nile crocodiles continue to grow and spread, the question remains, how will we take responsibility before it's too late? The Everglades may never feel the same again, and the story of Florida's new apex predator is a chilling reminder that when humans interfere with nature, the consequences are only limited by our imagination and our mistakes.